Well, thank you for that very nice introduction, and thank you all for being here and inviting me. It's a pleasure to be in Berlin and to talk about a topic that I've been working on for years or decades by now, the economics of women's rights. So let me start with the picture. This is just to show that there's a connection between women's rights or female empowerment and development. So what you see on the x-axis is the Women, Business and Law Index. It's an index of many different measures of women's rights, but legal rights. So I want to be very clear here. Today I want to talk about legal rights. Often when we talk about female empowerment, people mean something like relative education, or are women in the labor force, or, bargaining vis-a-vis their husbands, which is all also very interesting, and I have much work on that as well. But today I'm very interested in specifically in women's legal rights. And what you can see here is basically there is a high correlation between women's legal rights and development as measured in GDP per capita. So it's rich countries where women have more rights. So just to give you a few more examples, what kind of rights am I talking about? So do women have the same right? And when I say, legal rights, I'm always comparing them to male legal rights, right? What does it mean? Perfect rights, who knows? But, we can compare the legal position of a female with a male. So what percent of countries do women have the same right as a man to sign a contract? If you go back in history, 200 years ago, basically women could not sign any contracts in their own name. That has changed, and by now, 95% or 96% of all countries, women do have the same right to sign a contract as men do. Also means 4% or 4.2% countries, they don't. And if you look at the low-income countries, within the low-income countries, it's actually more. Only 89% of all countries, women have the same legal right to sign a contract. But that's one of the rights women have a lot, or in many countries. If we go down the list here, and these are just examples, there are many other rights you can think about, but can women obtain a passport in the same way as men do? Or do they actually need consent, or permission from either a father or a husband? Well, already 1/4 of countries, women don't. And again, if you look within low-income countries, it's actually more than 30% of countries, right? I'm not talking about population. I'm always talking about percent of countries where women don't have the same rights. And having a passport is kind of important if you want to travel, if you want to leave the country, and for many things. Interesting, totally different example now. Are you allowed to work the night shift in the same way as men do? Or are there restrictions that, in some cases women are not allowed to work at night? Well, again, there's actually a sizable fraction of countries where women don't. And again, higher and low income countries. And then what about legal protection against domestic violence? Well, that's only 25 or a quarter of all countries women have that. And in low income countries, it doesn't seem to exist. At least that's what the women law, what's called this database? The Women, Business and the Law database put together by the World Bank, which is actually a very interesting data set. If you're interested in this topic and want some data, I can highly recommend this. So what I'm interested in is understanding the origin of these rights or lack of rights, the political economy behind the women's rights. So there is a large literature. Many labor economists, in fact, and many applied people work on the consequences of rights or lack of rights. But there's much less work on the origins of the rights, or what makes the rights appear. What are drivers of reforms? How do reforms happen? And also, to what extent can economic factors explain this? Or is it just enlightenment or religion or, some other sort of factors outside of the realm of economics? Or can economics tell us something about how reforms happen and why women in rich countries on average have more rights than in poor countries? And also over time, of course, gain more rights. So what I want to talk about today is a bunch of different papers I've been working on. So I'll start with an overview and touch upon a bunch of different issues, and then I'll dive deeper into one particular newer research paper. And so in sum, this, obviously I didn't do all of this by myself, so I have a bunch of different co-authors for different parts of the project. Matthias Döpke, who I've been working with for a long time. Hanno Forster, who was a student, is now assistant professor in Boston College. Anna Hanusch was a colleague and is now a professor in Bonn. Laura Montenbroek and Alessandra Buena are both previous PhD students. Alessandra now tenured faculty at Stanford. So lots of people I've been working with over the years. So the structure of the talk, and let me just see, how much time do I have total? Just so that I'm ending on time.
45 minutes.
45 minutes? Okay. So until like 6:30. Right, just so I'm keeping.
You can go a bit far.
Okay. So let's see if I can talk about everything. I have a lot, but I'll see. So I want to start with the history of women's rights in the United States, and maybe I'll go over that relatively quickly, but I think it's kind of an interesting timeline how different kinds of rights evolved. And I will do this with the, let's say, example of the United States, because that's where most of my work has been on the United States. This is actually not that different in Germany. And in fact, many European countries have gone through a very similar transition, but really putting the data together and finding all the different rights and different years and dates for all the different countries, that's a whole project that I haven't done. So for the United States, I have the facts, but it's a very similar transition in other countries, rich countries. Then I want to spend some time talking about mechanisms and existing theories, and that's where some of my old work comes in, but also I'll be talking about some other people's theories. And then, number 3, I want to talk about that not everything was progress. This is not a linear progression, as in, no rights, more rights, more rights, and then at some point, perfect rights. There are many examples, or some examples, of kind of going backwards, losing rights. And so then I'll talk about that and a very specific new project that I have on sort of the losing rights. So let me start with the history of women's rights in the United States. And I want to, first of all, starting point, let's say 200 years ago, women essentially lost their legal identity upon marriage. So in terms of, at least for married women, they didn't have own rights. So I like this picture. This says, it's not the best quality picture, but it says, his latest purchase. So women were considered more like cattle. They can be bought and sold and didn't really have a legal identity, at least married women. That has obviously changed. We live in a very different world now. And the way I think about it is that basically the evolution of women's rights has gone through 4 different phases. I'm sure if you talk to an economic historian, they have many more phases and more subtleties. But from an economic point of view, I want to distinguish basically different types of rights. And these different types of rights happen, I think, in different time or episodes. So let's start with what I want to call economic rights. And with economic rights, I mean the right to sign a contract, the right to own property, right? If you can't own property, it's a bit hard to engage in an economic world by yourself. And so up until the mid-19th century, married women basically could not sign a contract or own property or even decide how family money is spent. And that all changed basically starting in the mid-19th century. So New York was one of the front-runner states. So the very first Married Women's Property Act was passed in New York in 1848. So 170 or almost 180 years by now. So Ernestine Rose was one of the sort of important proponents there, and it ended up passing at a time. Remember, women did not have the right to vote then. So it was male legislators who actually passed a law that allowed married women to own something. So that was sort of the first step. The political rights came later. So women in the United States got the right to vote in federal election only in 1920. So Germany was just before. 1918. So a bunch of countries were actually right after First World War, and then a bunch of other countries like I think Italy and France were after Second World War. Right? The reason I put in these two different pictures is because, so this is the women's suffrage, so headquarters, those fighting for female suffrage. You see a lot of women in the picture, and then you see the headquarters of the opposed to women's suffrage people, and you see largely men in the picture. However, that is not universally true. It's not just a fight sort of between men and women. As I tried to make clear in different kinds of laws and rights that were passed over the time, it was often the men also fighting for the laws for women, and also quite a substantial fraction of women opposed. So this is not about male versus female. This is much more complicated, and in fact, often it's really not about gender at all. It's more about what situation are the families in, and I'll get to that. So this is what I want to call the third phase, labor market rights. And here you can already, so this is John F. Kennedy signing the Equal Pay Act in 1963. So that was quite important in the labor market rights because it made it illegal for employers to pay women and men differently for the same work. Up until then, it was perfectly legal. And I'll get to that at the third part of my talk. We'll talk a lot about labor market rights. So the Equal Pay Act is only one example. There are others. But it was much later, right? If you think about the first economic rights, we're talking about the 19th century, and now we're almost a century later. And then last phase, I want to call body rights. So these are any kind of rights related to women's control over their own body. And yes, I put here the right to abortion, but I want to think about that more broadly also. Laws about sexual harassment, or other kind of, or rape in marriage, does it even exist? Things like that. And that was much later, and in fact ongoing. A lot of discussions we are having these days still about sort of body-related rights. And it's also an interesting example of a law that went, or a right that went one way and then back, right? So the Supreme Court in the United States in 1973 sort of decided that there was a fundamental right to privacy, and that sort of protected abortion. And then 50 years later, quite recently, that was almost taken back, right? The Supreme Court, in a decision, Dobbs versus Jackson, Women's Health Organization, decided that abortion is not a constitutional right, and that the states can decide. And in fact, quite a few states actually backtracked, and it's sort of illegal now. So that's an example of sort of a right going the other direction. Although I want to also be a little bit careful with the body rights. They're a little bit different from the other rights in the sense there is no analog of abortion for men, right? So all the other rights, there's like perfect symmetry in principle. The body rights maybe is a little bit more complicated. So that's the brief timeline, and I'm pretty sure if someone put this together also for Germany, I think this would be kind of very similar. The economic rights first, the political rights second, the labor rights third, and then this sort of discussion on body rights ongoing and sort of last. So now I want to come back sort of to trying to understand how these rights evolve, what are reasons for reform, what are mechanisms, what are existing theories, what does the literature have to say about this? And specifically, obviously I'm an economist, so taking the economics perspectives, can economics explain the expansion of women's rights and exactly which channels, what are the drivers? To do so, we need to explain the political preferences for individual people, right? Who gains, who loses from these rights? How would people vote, and why? And why does it change? And what are the specific channels that actually matter for determining the political preferences? So it's not going to be any deep theory of the political system, by the way. If there are political economy sort of theorists or just political economists in the audience, I'm not going to talk about, details of the political process. But I want to understand more, why does the opinion of the majority shift? What do individual people want and how would they vote? Okay. And how important are economic drivers relative to alternatives, just culture, enlightenment, something like that. So to think about the political economy of women's rights, what I think is important, at least sort of 4 different channels. And what I mean with channels, and I'll illustrate that briefly with a theoretical model, with just a theoretical setup, it's just sort of a view on how these preferences are formed and what matters for the preferences. And the first I call the bargaining power channel, then the parental altruism channel, income channel, and public policy channel, right? So how do rights affect, for example, the family income? Or how do rights affect, for example, what public policies are implemented? And all of this can then feed back into how individual preferences are about their rights. Are they benefiting from more rights or they're losing from more rights? And who benefits, who loses, okay? So I want to spend basically a few minutes on each of these 4 channels. And so don't worry, I'm not going to, show a lot of equations, but a little bit of notation in the setup I think is useful here. So the idea is, right, I said this before, the political views are founded in individual preferences. So think about the individual preferences of a person, so V, a value function of a person of gender G, is just, a very simple utility function here. So first of all, that person of gender G, what's relevant is the human capital of that person, so that's the age. And maybe that spouse's human capital. So HF, let's say it's the female, and it's the male human capital. And with X, I mean the law. The law, think about it in a simple way right now. Do women have rights or not? Right? So X could be either 0 or 1. And then what matters is their own consumption. That's the utility of that period, consumption of that person. This can be leisure. And G is a public good. And then as a continuation value, this could be the human capital of the kids entering. So think about just the next generation. And, maybe if you care about your kids, maybe you care how the law will be in the future. Maybe you have some daughters and you care about how the rights for the women, for your daughters play out. That would be the X prime. So that's the law, the next period. Okay? So that's the basic setup. And so now think about the bargaining power channel. That's simply the idea that women's rights affect bargaining power in marriage. So basically it changes the outside option. Right, if women have no rights whatsoever, they can't even own anything, they cannot sign contracts, even if your husband is beating you, what are you going to do? Basically, you have no options, so you're kind of stuck sort of in a bad position. And so, but if you just think about that part, so how would it enter in the simple, right? This is the same utility function or the same value function I showed before. How would the bargaining power channel enter? Well, it's just that the consumption of the female versus the male, now the share of how much they get from the total family income, right? So I, it's total family income. That can be a function of the human capital, of him and her, and also the law potentially. But most importantly for the bargaining power channel is the share, how much she eats and how much he eats, is a function of the law. Because of this, how the law determines outside options. Right? So then greater women's rights increase women's bargaining power and lower man's bargaining power. So all else equal, if this is all there is, then this is a question about gender, right? Women want rights, men don't want them to have rights. That's it. Well, that is one of the channels. Women, I guess, benefit a little bit more than men, but that cannot be the end of the story. Otherwise, women wouldn't have gotten any rights before they were allowed to vote, right? So what else could there be? I mentioned before daughters, so that's parental altruism. Daughters, or also children more generally, if people and men, if anyone, cares about children, right? That's why I had the continuation value here. This is sort of the children's, the next generation's utility. Well, the human capital of the children could be a function also of the law in the following sense. For example, and it's been shown in many different contexts, that women, all as equal mothers, seem to care more about the education of their children, or at least act that way. So they spend more time doing the homework with the kids in Germany than the fathers, but also in other countries. So the quantity-quality trade-off seems to be a little bit more towards quality for mothers and quantity for fathers. And so, but if women have no rights, they cannot even choose, right? They might be forced to having many children, but if they have more rights, they can actually invest more in the education of their own children, and that can be good for the future generations, right? So then, well, if that's the case, what would the political preference depend on? So who would now benefit from rights? Well, potentially also fathers, because if they then give their wives more rights, they will invest more in the education. It can be a good thing for the whole family. And so, for example, also the number of, so first of all, how important is human capital? Then matters, right? If you are in a very agricultural, very poor society, maybe human capital is irrelevant, then this channel would not be very active. But if in a knowledge-dominated economy, then the channel is very active. But also the number of sons versus daughters any given family has. So Ebonia Washington has a nice paper, like quite old by now, I think published in the QJE, where she showed that legislators in the United States, if they had more daughters, they voted differently compared to if they had only sons. So if you care about your kids and you happen to have only daughters, then on the margin, they vote more for pro-women. So that's the altruism channel. And let me maybe skip this, but Matthias and I have an old paper on this where we actually explore the importance just of this altruism channel for the evolution of the economic rights specifically in the United States. And what we argue there is that as basically returns to human capital increased over time because of technological progress, this altruism channel became more and more important because of the investment in the human capital of the children. And that led to a switch, right, of the voting. So to understand reforms, you need to not only understand who benefits and loses, but something needs to change over time, that the majority maybe before was losing and then at some point is gaining. And that's what we showed in this older paper, that the rise in the returns to human capital changes the trade-off between these two channels, the bargaining channel and the parental altruism channel. And then if the returns are high enough, that leads for the majority opinion to switch, basically. Now let's talk about the income channel. So the income channel is just the idea that if women have more rights, that can have an impact on family income. And this can have multiple reasons why. So I wrote down here the budget constraints. So I, again, is the family income. And what is family income? Well, it's the hours worked, let's say, NF of the female times her human capital times her wages. Wages can be a function of the rights. If she's, for example, not allowed to work, or not allowed to work the night shift, or not allowed to work more than 8 hours per day, that could have some negative implication on her wages, potentially, right? And this is the same term for males, right? So if you're just focusing on maximizing family income, well, how would now think about the family, their political preferences for or against rights, what would they depend on now? Well, they depend on own and spouse labor supply. So specifically, if you have a more traditional family model where the woman is not going to work anyways, then who cares about the wage, right? So even if the rights depress female wages, but if she's not going to work anyways, then that part is irrelevant. But then in such a family, husband and wife would agree. This is not about gender now. It's about family types. So what kind of family, is this? Is it a family where both work or not? And also what matters is to what extent is your own labor, or male labor, let's say, substitutable with women's labor. So if you're worried about women in general entering your kind of industry and taking away your job or depressing your wages because you see them as competition, because they're very complementary, very substitutable, then that's more of a problem. If they're very complementary, if you're a factory owner of a textile industry and you want for your company lots of women to work for you, then you're very complementary, right? And then you actually benefit from giving women a lot of labor market rights, or allowing them to work in your companies. But if you're doing the same thing and you're worried about the women sort of taking away your jobs or depressing your wages, that's a very different story, right? But then political support here does not primarily or not at all depend on gender. It's really more men with working spouses. They would support rights, and also men whose labor is complementary to women labor. Yeah, so there's a very interesting paper also old by now, by Geddes and Luke on exactly this income channel. So let me just mention that briefly without going into details, but whoever is interested in this line of research, I highly recommend reading this paper. Let me now talk about the public policy channel. And this is the last channel. I don't want to bore you with too many channels, but I think they're all quite relevant to understanding the evolution of these rights and to understanding, the different timing, because I think for the different kinds of rights, different channels are relevant. The public policy channel, what I mean here is that, and this is this is most relevant for the political rights, because the idea is that whether women are allowed to vote or not affects political majorities. And then you can think about whether you want to include such women in the electorate or not. And so here the idea is that it affects majorities and hence public policies. So that's why there is a P now here in the utility function. And so what kind of policy gets into place? For example, does defense spending go up, or spending on schools go up, or taxes go up or down or whatever, could in principle be a function of who's a voter, and are women also voters? And so then political preferences would depend on the similarity of own preference for public goods with those of women. So for example, if you're a little bit more so at least traditionally, often women were a little bit more on the left. I think it's been changing recently, which is partly a function of them being poorer and needing more welfare. And so then if you're on the left and you want the women in your electorate, if you're on the right, you don't. But I think things have changed, but traditionally that was often the case. And so then what could be a trigger for reforms here? Well, technological progress and also the increase in female labor force participation, this has led over time to women working more and more, and also the gender wage gap closing. So in some sense, women are becoming more and more like men. And so that aligns their political preferences more. So they want maybe now more similar tax rates and more similar spending on public goods. And then hence the cost of including them in the electorate, if they don't have completely opposed preferences, is small or zero, or can be in fact beneficial. And again, I want to sort of highlight one particularly interesting paper that is based specifically on this channel, and this is by Graziella Bertacci, also published more than 15 years by now. And so she has a very interesting model on specifically the historical evolution of the political rights, and it's specifically on different attitudes on the optimal tax rates between men and women. And over time, basically, the attitudes get more similar because of the closing of the gender wage gap, and then that triggers reform. Okay, so let me briefly stop here, grab a bit of water. And then I want to move on to this last part, and maybe it's the longest part, on not everything was progress. And this is very specific now. Now I'm done with the overview talk and want to dive into one specific research project that I'm currently working on. And yeah, so this is, I think, an interesting example of also historical. So I'm not talking about the abortion that may be recently backtracked. This is an historical example still of sort of a kind of evolution of women's rights going in the opposite direction. This is starting in the mid-19th century. No, sorry. Okay, I'm already at the second bullet. So the mid-20th century, or beginning to mid-20th century. So around 1910, 1920, 1930, actually. So during the first half of the 20th century, many legal restrictions were put on women's labor market opportunities. And again, I'll show you data and timing from the United States. But if you try digging and finding the dates for Germany, I'm pretty sure it's very similar. But I haven't put it all together in a nice way yet. But like my, at least historical reading seems to suggest it's very similar. And I'll give you more details on what kind of laws I'm talking about here. But basically, there were a lot of legal restrictions put on women, which I would say that's a lack of rights or losing rights relative to men, because men did not have or get the same restrictions. These laws were usually just or sometimes justified as so-called protective legislation. But we want to ask here in this paper, who is being protected? Is it really the women? It's not so clear. Right? And again, we want to understand this from a political economy perspective. What triggers reform? So what are the types of laws I'm talking about? So specifically, maximum hours laws. So how many hours are you allowed to work? Now, we do have these kind of laws now in Germany, right? Like you're not allowed to work 20 hours in a row, and not even 12, I think. But we have them symmetrically for men and women. Here, these were laws only for women. Okay, so women could not work more than 10 hours a day, or sometimes not more than 50 hours a week, versus there was no analog for men. Similarly, night shift bans for women that also were in place in quite a few states, or introduced sort of in quite a few states at that time. So by 1928, about a third of all states had some kind of a ban on night shift, working the night shift for women. Now you might ask, well, who cares about the night shift? No one's working at night anyways. That's not true. So in North Carolina, just to give one example, about 40% of all the female workers were actually working the night shift. Why? Women often preferred to work at night because that's when the kids were sleeping. And also certain kind of jobs were done at night, or certain kind of factories that were trying to run them the whole, around the clock, and then someone needs to do the night shift. Minimum wage laws that also were passed specifically only for women. Seating laws, I thought that was kind of curious. So it's a law that required women to be able to sit down while working, not the whole time, but they needed to have some opportunity to sit down and rest. Again, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you don't have that same requirement for male employees, it makes women a little bit more expensive, right? You don't need to just buy a chair. You need maybe a room, more space, more rent. So for the factory owner, then maybe on the margin, it's better to employ a man. And similarly with weight laws, this is not about the weight of the women, obviously. This is how much weight women are allowed to lift. And there were quite a few states that allowed them not to lift more than 25 pounds. And that was also sometimes a binding constraint. For example, typewriters. This was before computers, obviously. Typewriters were heavy. They actually often weighted more than 25 pounds. And in certain kind of positions, you actually, especially for advancements, you needed to lift certain things, not all the time, but occasionally, and then that banned women from certain kinds of occupations and jobs. Just to show you a little bit of the spread, so this is a map of the United States, and I will show you basically 5 different colors, or 6 actually, 0 laws. So basically, it's just an index of all of these 5 types of laws. And state by state, we're just counting how many of, did you have any seating laws or any weight law? They're all not identical, obviously, but, did you have some night shift ban? And what you see is in 1880, basically, there were hardly any such laws in place, right? Just Wisconsin and Massachusetts had 1, and that's it. And then we're going now forward by 1900, little bit. 1910, the map is already getting more colorful. And then by 1920 and especially 1930, it's getting darker. Darker meaning, remember, the black means all 5 laws in place. So especially here, the West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington, they all had 5 laws. And the only state left with no laws, Florida. To show you a little bit more about the evolution of the law, so when was sort of the main period in which they were introduced, we put together here now an index for the entire United States, right? Just counting, it's very simple. How many laws did an average state have out of these 5 potential laws? And that's actually the solid line. All the different colors are the different kinds of laws, but let's ignore that. Let's look at only the black line. So basically 1870, 0. And then it kind of starts increasing here, late 19th century. But the, let's say, height of the introduction, the period that, of accelerated introduction of these laws, were started in 1910 and sort of went until 1920, this period. And then it's kind of flat thereafter. Okay? Now, you might wonder, how did they disappear? Or do we still have all of these laws? No, we don't. They actually disappeared in the following sense. The era of this so-called protective legislation ended in the 1960s with basically a series of court decisions. Well, most important first was the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Civil Rights Act, the Title VII actually included, and this was included quite late actually, in the whole discussion, that was illegal to discriminate based on, age and race and so forth, but also sex. And then the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was founded or created. And then that led to a series of court cases, basically individual people challenging state laws that created this asymmetry between men and women, right? The night shift bans, they were being challenged, saying this is against the Constitution or against the Civil Rights Act. And then they won, basically. It took a while. The most important court case, according to our reading of history, is this one, 1968, Rosenfeld versus Southern Pacific Company, and that is widely interpreted as ending state protective legislation. So that's the history. So now let's come back to the economics. So what we're trying to argue in this paper is that it was the concern about labor market competition from women that drove much of this change. So this is related to the income channel I was talking about earlier. How do we arrive at this conclusion? Well, first I'll show you a model, a political economy model to spell out the mechanism. I'll show you some data that is in line with the mechanism to convince you sort of this is going on. And then we have new and so first, this is just data about the United States, the whole country. The timing seems to work well. But then to test this more seriously empirically, we put together a comprehensive cross-state data set on all of these different laws and, a bunch of different drivers, and also to test then alternative hypotheses. Okay, so let me start with the model, then this sort of overall United States application, and then hopefully, if I get to that, some state-level empirical evidence. Okay, so in the model, there are people, they're singles and married couples. So again, this will also be a model where the the preferences in the end will not, or the who likes rights and who doesn't will not be so much along gender lines. It will be much more household types that matter. And that's why we have singles and married. And now we'll talk about other kinds of ways in which households differ from each other and how that then leads to their voting behavior in the model. Specifically, 2 important types of heterogeneity we're introducing here. For men, we think is relevant is skill. Just to keep it simple and tractable, let's just think about 2 types of skill, unskilled and skilled. Okay? For women, what matters most is whether they're actually working. So whether they're working in the market, whether they're entering the labor force. And the easiest way to think about that in the model is just to distinguish women by their home productivity, low and high. And if you have a high home productivity, well, then you will always work at home. But if you have and hence not in the market. But if you have a low home productivity, you might as well work in the market. And one way to think about that is, home productivity being also related to the presence of children. So if you're single and there are no children, then yeah, you have a low home productivity. There's no one who needs your home production so much. And then you might as well work in the market. Right? So that's why we're assuming all single women have low home productivity, just to keep it simple. It's not meant as a super realistic model, but we're trying to illustrate specific mechanisms here and keeping it tractable and simple for that purpose. But already with these simple assumptions, the model will have 7 different types of households. So there will be 3 different types of singles, namely unskilled men, skilled men, and low home productivity women. And then 4 different types of couples, namely any combination of unskilled versus skilled men and high and low home productivity women. And then in the end, this is not super important, but we want a dynamic model, right? We are interested in changes over time. And so we want actually these types to change over time. And so we also need people to disappear from the model. We'll keep adding new people, but also we have some mortality rate here. So just people die, and then we replenish the people with new people, but potentially from different household types as before. So they don't choose to get married here in the model. They're just kind of born that way. So this is in many ways the most important slide of the model. So if you've been falling asleep in the back, pay attention now. So it's the production function that matters for everything here. And there are 2 types of production function. There's one, so it's basically a model of structural change. There's agricultural production, and there's a modern or urban sector. And the technology in these 2 sectors is quite different. Namely, and again, we're keeping it simple. So in the agricultural sector, a very simple Cobb-Douglas production function with 3 different types of labor is input. Namely, the female labor, the unskilled male labor, and the skilled male labor. And they're all complementary to each other. So just think about a family farm, and what do you need? You need some men who are strong, and they can do some of the heavy lifting. You need also some skilled labor, maybe keeping an overview and ordering the fertilizer at the right time, or deciding which plots to farm with what crop and so forth. And you also need some women who are maybe tending the chicken and doing some of the vegetable gardens and some of the other tasks. Okay? So they're all needed and they're all complementary to each other. In the modern sector, it's a bit different. In the modern sector, and let's just focus on that very first equation here. Think about a modern sector in which men and women can work alongside each other. Think about a textile, factory, for example. So, or other factories. Men and women, it's unskilled men and women, their labor is very substitutable. They're doing the same task. It doesn't matter who's sitting next to the sewing machine. Maybe the women a little bit faster, who knows, but it doesn't matter who's doing the sewing. And so that's why this production function, this is the females and this is the unskilled men, and they're completely substitutable. Yes, we're allowing for a gender wage gap here, that's the phi, so it could be women are a little bit less productive perhaps, but then, per efficiency unit, they're still doing the exact same thing. And the skilled man is different because they're the factory owners, let's say, or the organizers, the managers, and they are complementary again to the unskilled labor. And then the reason there are like 2 more urban sectors is just to allow for there being some segregation by gender in some industries. Think about shipyards. I mean, there were not that many women until the war, at least, working, on building ships. And this is just to show basically the story. Everything is robust, even if there's some sectors in which men and women don't work alongside each other. As long as there is some sector, some modern sector in which they do, and that sector is actually active, then everything will go through. Okay? And now the other most important, so that's the one thing that's super important for the model and from the slide is the 2 different production functions and the different complementarity versus substitutability of male and female labor. The other thing that's important from this slide is how does the law now come in, right? This is a model about the political economy of reforms. So it's going to be people voting for rights or against rights. So what do rights mean here? Well, we're just keeping it super simple, but I was trying to argue before that a lot of these rights make women, or the lack of rights, a lot of these laws, these restrictions make women a little bit less productive. From if you're the employer, now you need to buy a chair. Now she cannot work anymore. It's, 8 o'clock and she needs to stop. Or you need someone to work the night shift. Cannot be her. So they're less productive. And so that's the psi here. But the difference in psi is something people can vote on. So people can vote on psi being 1, no restrictions, or psi being some number less than 1. So just think about it, there's just these 2 options, either no restrictions or restrictions. And the restriction is just some number less than 1, okay? And then they can vote on this. Just to close the model, and maybe I need to wrap up here because I want to show some empirical results. There is some output. This is just an aggregate production function, how all the different sectors are aggregated up, not so important. This is just a utility function. The thing I should highlight from here, think about consumption in marriage being a public good and also home production. If the woman works at home, there's some home production good queue, but men and women get the exact same thing. There's no disagreement in marriage here. So in a given household, men and women will always vote the exact same thing, namely they want to jointly maximize total household income. So each period then, I think I pretty much said that, people will vote on this psi, okay? And decision, again, I said this is not an elaborate model of political economy. It's just decision by majority vote. As long as the majority is for setting some psi less than 1, it will be implemented. Maybe skip the timing as well. I think it's kind of obvious. So this is actually quite an equilibrium model in the background, right? So there will be beliefs about the laws, there will be wages, right? And the wages will be implemented or affected by the laws. The firms will maximize profits. So there's a lot of stuff going on in the background. You need all that to close the model. Labor market clears, good market clears, and then the policy is implemented by the majority of the people in the model. So what are results then? What follows from this model? Well, first of all, the wages for each type of labor is equalized across regions. So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether you work on the farm or in urban sectors. Oh, and I should have said, couples will have to decide to move together. So when they decide, do I want to work in agriculture or in the city, they have to do that together. It's not possible to live on the farm but work in the factory, okay? I think that's sort of simple, the geography kind of works that way, and in most cases, it was that way in the data as well. So then the high home productivity women, they live in the urban areas together with their husbands. If both men and women supply labor in that mixed model, then everything in that mixed sector, the one that was called both before, right, this one, sorry, both sector, If that one is operative, then everything collapses to one overall aggregate production function. And imposing protective legislation then, so this Xi less than 1, reduces the productivity in the modern sector overall. It's almost like a TFP shock, and hence increases the price of the modern good. That can be good for people working in the modern sector, but bad for people working in agriculture who want to buy the modern good. So then, now let's come to the key insight, and then I'll take that insight to the data. So the key insight here is now trying to understand which groups now support restricting women's work in this model. So on the one, or most importantly, it will be unskilled men in the modern sector. They like restrictions because it increases their wages. But they like it only if they're single or if their own wife does not work. If their own wife does work, well, yes, their wages will go up, but the wife's wage will go down, and that it's not worth it. So it's the men who compete with women in the labor market but have no working wives that offsets that effect. And even the unskilled men in these entirely male sectors, the same thing would apply to them, right? If you think about the shipyards, maybe there's no women directly working next to you, but the overall equilibrium effects would kick in and their wages are affected the same way, okay? In agriculture, it's different. People are not directly affected, but they're affected through the equilibrium effects of the prices. They want to buy the modern goods and they don't want to spend more than they need to. So that basically leads us to, this is all the different groups in the economy or in my model. And the only ones who are for restrictions are unskilled men in the modern sector with non-working wives or single men in the single unskilled men working in the modern sector. And then again, the wives here, these non-working wives too, right? They would vote alongside their husbands. They don't want other working women to basically take their husband's jobs away. So now let's get to the data. How does this now look like in the data? So we put from US Census data, just for the whole country, we counted what are the fractions of people basically in the data in exactly the same groups. So are there enough of the blue basically here to, make the majority? And if you do that, this is the picture that comes up. So I don't know why we swapped the colors here, but the red now are the groups in favor of restrictions. Okay? The reds are the low-skilled single men or low-skilled men with their non-working wives. And I should be very clear, women got the right to vote, and that's already in the picture. So up until 1920, we're counting only men, but from there onwards, we're also including the women in these pictures, right? In how we're counting so these are not population shares, these are sort of vote shares. And what you can see is that basically these two groups in favor of restrictions, they were too small initially, but then, so the white line is 50%. But by 1910, together they were more than half of the population. And so if they all voted, they should have voted for restrictions. And then they kept that majority for a while. And then it was kind of a knife edge case. So I don't know, I guess laws don't disappear if there's basically knife edge. But then starting from the 60s, a sizable majority was against the restrictions. And that's precisely when they disappeared in reality. So what we do, and I know I don't have much more time, but I wanted to just briefly flash this because we can then use the model to understand better the forces. What was important now for the introduction and the removal of the law? And so we use a model to do a bunch of counterfactuals. What would have happened if women had never gained the right to vote? Or what would have happened if structural change would have not happened? And so let me just summarize that and then show you one more empirical result, and then I guess I'll end. Okay. So which forces matter most, right? So now we're using the model to do counterfactuals just to see which of the forces basically, maybe I should have showed this one picture. This is the vote shares from the model simulation, feeding into the model basically structural change and the change in this household composition. That's exogenous. And so then we see basically in the model we predict 1910, the majority is in favor of the restrictions, then it's sort of knife edge for a while. In 1960, restrictions are lifted, okay? So now I can redo pictures like this, but for different counterfactuals. What if there had never been any skill growth? What if women had always been allowed to vote, and so forth? So rather than showing you all the pictures, let me summarize here these different counterfactuals. But what we find is that without structural change, so without this movement from the farms, from the countryside to the cities, restrictions would have never been implemented. We would have never had these restrictive laws if we're still living on farms today. That's the first thing. Second, how do the right to vote of women matter? Well, had women had the right to vote earlier, suppose women could have always voted, then restrictions would have still happened, but a little bit later. So that would have delayed the introduction of the restrictions, but it's not like they would have never happened. So because there were also a bunch of women, non-working wives, who liked the restriction. They wanted to put restrictions basically on other women. If female labor force participation had never risen, well, then the restrictions would have persisted much longer. So that was an important factor in the removal of the laws, that women were working. And more working women, that meant those women didn't want the restrictions and their husbands didn't want them either. And that led to the majority in the opposite direction. And then finally, what about skill growth of men? Men over time have gotten more and more skilled. And remember, skilled men are complementary to the women, to female labor. And so they don't want restrictions either. And so had there been less skill growth, the restriction would have lasted longer, okay? But quantitatively, actually, the rise in female labor force participation is more important than the skill growth of the men in our model. So in terms of evidence, I know there are a lot of empirical people here in the room, and they're probably not so happy with this as my only piece of evidence, right? You want to see some regression, something a little bit more. And so what we do is now we look at the same logic state by state, so, and also law by law. So basically asking the questions, did the states, because in terms of, composition of singles versus married, but also were people living in the cities versus farm, were they skilled or not? The states were very different. The timing was very different. And so the question now is, did the states where the majority, basically this red group had the majority earlier, did they also introduce these laws earlier or at all, let's say? So in principle, I could also show you 50 such pictures, state by state, and that's going to be a lot of pictures. So what I'm doing is now running the regression analog of that, okay? That's the state level evidence I'm showing. So now this is not your standard regression table. Each number here is a regression, a coefficient from a different regression. So just to be very clear, we're regressing now indicators of laws introduction on predicted vote shares in favor. So basically, state by state, I'm counting basically these people that my model predicted to be in favor of the restrictions. So unskilled men, their non-working wives, unskilled single men, counting all of them, and trying to explain the introduction of the law with that, okay? And so then there's basically, this is just with no controls. And then, so I think the column 4 is the most interesting one. That's with time-fixed effects and state-fixed effects. So let's focus on the last column. But again, that last column is not one regression. It's actually 4 regressions, because now we're looking at different kinds of laws here. So this is just any law, and you see a positive, significant relationship. So when there were more people in favor, any law was introduced basically earlier. Same with the work time laws. So this is the night shift bans and the maximum hour laws. And then, the Yeah, and then the work condition laws, those are the seating laws and the wage laws, okay? So you see it for all of these 3 types of laws. The minimum wage is a little bit different, so that the regressions don't work, but also think about the logic. Just because there's a minimum wage, why would that make women less productive, right? Through the eyes of our model, the minimum wages don't really fit. So you can even see this as sort of a test. Maybe it's good, it doesn't work. Because the logic would be quite different, I think. And then we also ran some regressions on the end of the protective laws. Now, that's a bit trickier because they did not end state by state, obviously. They ended because of the Supreme Court decisions. So then we don't have any variation. So what we used instead, and we can quibble about whether it's a good proxy, but there were these equal right amendments, which were largely considered as, if you pass an equal right amendments, that would make these restrictions also disappear because they were also incompatible with equal rights, basically. And these were also introduced state by state, and also there was a federal equal right amendment, which was then ratified state by state. So we use that variation sort of as a proxy for the removal. And we also find here, now we're expecting negative coefficients, right? We want, when the predicted vote share in favor is high, then we don't want it to end. We don't want the equal right amendment to be passed, right? That's why we're expecting negative coefficients, and there are, all of them are negative here with these different kinds of proxies. So I think I should stop here. So just to, for whoever is interested, we also, look at some evidence for some alternative hypothesis, and we rule the other ones out, we think. But if someone has better data and more evidence, that could be interesting to pursue. And so let me just conclude here about this one specific project, that there are a bunch of different laws, or let me summarize basically. There were different kinds of laws that restricted female work that were introduced in the United States at the beginning of the 20th century, or the first half of the 20th century, and then disappeared in the 60s. We provided a political economy model focusing on the labor market competition channel to show why they were introduced and then lifted again. And that matches the pattern quite well. And the main driver of the introduction is the structural change of the unskilled men and the non-working wives moving from agriculture to the modern sector. And the main driver of the removal is the increase in the share of married women working. That's it. Thank you very much.